You know, so mine's on. I just done it.
That's right.
I know.
All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's installment of the Distinguished Speakers Series in International Business as we celebrate Women's History Month. I'm Rebecca Bellinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Global Business, and on behalf of the Center, I'd like to welcome all of you to the event, certainly our distinguished guests to the event as well, and all of those who are joining us via live stream who are not able to be here in person. We're here this evening in conversation about women in global business with our Dean Ritu Agarwal and the President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Suzanne Clark, again in celebration and recognition as the first event of Women's History Month at Maryland Smith. Tonight's event is just one of the many activities that we do at the Center. In the next few weeks, we hope that you will consider joining us at a couple of our next events, including on March 27th, we have the inaugural International Business Trek to Baltimore. On April 17th is our second annual Embassy Day, and then also in April, you will have the annual forum that we hope you'll join us at. The Center is proud to be one of 15 business schools nationwide that have been awarded a Title VI grant known as SIBE from the U.S. Department of Education, without which this event and other of our activities would not be possible. So before we turn to the main event and really introduce our speakers, a couple of announcements for you. First, this is meant to be an interactive session, so we expect you to answer, or not ansher questions, unless you have them.
Oh, this is a good idea, yeah.
So get ready to answer questions.
I have a lot of questions.
But we hope you will ask questions as well, and that's really the point. So there will be a microphone that will be handed around. If you do have a question, raise your hand, stand up, and we'll get the microphone to you. Please introduce yourself before you ask your question. If you're joining us via live stream, there is an opportunity for you two to interact. Please go ahead and tweet at us your questions, and that's at Smith Global Biz with a Z. Or you can email, if you want that to be private, to Santiago Luna, and his email address is sluna@rhsmith.umd.edu. With that, our speakers. So please allow me to introduce our guest, Suzanne Clark. Suzanne is the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest business federation in the world. She took on this role in 2019, becoming the organization's first female president in its 108-year history. Her prior positions at the Chamber include Chief of Staff, COO, and Senior Executive Vice President. In industry, she worked alongside leadership at the American Trucking Association, served as president of the National Journal Group, and acquired and led the boutique firm, the Potomac Research Group, which was recognized by Inc. 500 as one of the fastest growing private companies in 2012. Suzanne knows communications, U.S. businesses, operations, trucking, digital journalism, and global. She's joined by Smith's own fearless leader, distinguished university professor, and interim dean, Ritu Agarwal. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you, Rebecca. And before I get started with my first question, a big shout out to Rebecca and her team and the Center for Global Business for giving us the opportunity to host such a distinguished speaker. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you.
So Suzanne and I have chit-chatted a lot before coming to the stage. So she's already answered all of my questions. I know she's looking forward to answering all of your questions. I do have a series of domains, if you will, that I'm going to cover with her. But again, as Rebecca said, let's keep this interactive, and we look forward to questions from the audience as well. So Suzanne, let me kick things off. Rebecca told us a little bit about your background, but help everybody in the audience understand your journey to this position, how you got here, where you came from, what are some of the struggles that you've dealt with on the way?
Well, I hope everybody has several hours because this is a long, boring story. Maybe I can even just leave that there. Okay. You can hear me okay? Mm-hmm. All right, we'll just leave it where it is. Nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to put it back. Okay, I'll just hold it. Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and I really want to congratulate all of you for not only studying business, which I think is a really important profession and a noble calling, but also taking time in your free time like this to think about your careers and your future. And it really says something about you that you're dedicating your personal time like this to come and expand your knowledge and expand your network. So congratulations on that hard work, and thank you for being here. I'm 52. I always, when I'm listening to people, I have all these questions about them I'm trying to figure out in my head. So I'm 52. I'm a Cancer. I have one 13-year-old child who will be 14 next week. I have 2 Labradoodles who get mad and tweet at me if I do not mention them in public remarks. I did 2 degrees at Georgetown, which I'm not supposed to mention here.
That's
so we'll
right.
just keep that quiet.
We
keep
want
that.
her.
I'm sure it's just because I couldn't get into Maryland. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And I worked my way through my first degree at Georgetown as a secretary at the American Trucking Associations. And I really thought I was just kind of waitressing my way through college, so to speak. But I worked for a great guy who really sponsored me, and he kept promoting me anyway. So that by the time I finished school, which took forever at night, by the time I finished school, I was also the chief of staff at this trade association. And then as it was kind of time for me to go do my next thing, he was going to do his next thing and go run the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so I got to keep my boss, but move into D.C., have a much bigger playing field, and I went there as chief of staff. And then again, I was thinking of leaving, and the board asked if I would stay, and they said, we know you want a learning experience, and so they actually paid for my executive MBA if I would stay there, which was, on one hand, amazing, and on the other hand, as I was taking the GMATs, I'm like, what just happened? I was going to move and get a new job, and now I'm studying. I don't know how it happened. And when I left my MBA, they gave me the chance to be the chief operating officer, and I was super excited to learn the business side of this policy world. So I did that. I was recruited away to run a media company, which I loved, and the products were all focused on people who do public policy for a living. As we were starting new businesses for that private owner, the adjacent market was Wall Street that really did not understand the impact of public policy on their portfolios. Started a company for that owner, bought it, held it for 5 years, had an exit, just as the CEO's wife was getting sick at the chamber. So here's the guy who's my first boss at ATA. Flash forward all this time, I've been gone from the chamber for almost a decade, and he and the board said, would you come back and help us at the chamber? And I thought, oh, this is the perfect timing. While I'm doing an exit, I'll be there a year. Now it's been 5 years. It's like Hotel California there. It's so interesting and so complex, and I think so aligned with my belief system that I just keep staying.
That's an incredible story, and it's remarkable how you've gone through this wide range of experiences. So I think you're perfectly positioned to take on, the challenges of all your member companies. Which brings me to my next question. I'm sure there are many people in the audience who have this notion of what the Chamber of Commerce does, and I'm sure at least 90% of those notions are incorrect. So maybe let's start by kind of having you described what exactly does the U.S. Chamber of Commerce do, and then what do you do in your role as president?
Okay, so I'll ask a question. I promise not to call on you if you raise your hand. I just want a show of hands. Who has heard of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Okay. Now, who thinks if I won't, but who thinks if I asked you what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce does that you would have a good answer?
See, I told you.
How many of you are aware of the Chamber of Commerce in your hometown? How many of you are aware of an American Chamber of Commerce abroad? Okay, that just gives me a sense. So every great story, and I want you to remember this as you enter the job market, every great story starts with President Taft.
That's right.
That's not actually true. That's really bad advice.
No.
But this story starts with
line.
President Taft, and this story starts with President Taft because, I don't know, what year, Courtney? What year did President Taft have this brilliant idea? 120 years ago or so, right? Okay, that was a really specific answer for you to have the around in front of it, but okay. So President Taft comes to the business community across the country and he says, other groups like the unions have a national presence, but business is all fragmented. And so several hundred state and local chambers came together and bought the only land facing the White House and built a national chamber of commerce. And it was an incredible thing and an incredible expense for all these local communities to do. And when you come to the building next, you will see a big brass plaque and all these little tiny towns all across the country are there. And I always challenge people to find their hometown or their parents' hometown because it's amazing. At our roots, that's still who we are. We have state and local chambers who are members, probably 1,500 of them. We have trade associations, so the National Association of Manufacturers or the airlines or retail or the banks who write us checks. We have 80% of the Fortune 1000 and hundreds of thousands of small businesses. There are 117 or 18 American Chambers of Commerce abroad, and there are, depending on the day, around 18 bilateral business councils that we run. So it's a federation of business interests from small companies to large, from small towns to global cities. But at its core, the belief system is that communities and families are better off when there is economic growth and job creation. So we wake up every day and try to figure out from our smallest member to our biggest what we can do to help them grow and create jobs. That means that we have policy experts, that we have lobbyists, we have our own law firm. It means that we have research people, think tank people. We have issue experts on every issue you can imagine and 50 that you never want to hear about. I mean, it's a remarkably geeky, wonky public policy place.
We're a university. We love geeky and wonky.
Well, we are match made in heaven. So I know you asked me a two-part question, but I'll pause because that was a long answer.
No, that's a great answer. So the second part of my question was really, what services do you provide for your member companies, and what do you do in your role as president?
So I think our job is to help companies figure out what it would take to grow, right, and to create jobs. And the two things I hear the most from CEOs right now that is holding them back, and I mean small companies and big companies, I mean domestic companies and global, it's either uncertainty, right? Yeah. Now we have the virus, but it's been trade and tariffs, et cetera. But the second is workforce issues. And that, depending on your geography and your industry, it's something around immigration, skills, training, education. We have a lot of jobs without people. We also have people without jobs, which is a separate issue, but we have a lot of jobs without people, which is good news, I think, for all of you. Sometimes what our members need us to do is do things they can't do with their own brand, stand up for an issue that might not be popular with the public. Sometimes they need us to do that. Sometimes what they need us to do is work on a bipartisan basis to really get a trade agreement done. When we were doing USMCA, the trade deal with Mexico and Canada last year, it took more than 1,000 local events with all those state and local chambers to prove to members of Congress that it was important to jobs and the economy in their hometown. And so sometimes that's what they need from us, and sometimes it's really specific. They might have a pension plan problem or a tax problem or something they don't understand. There might be a piece of litigation that they're really worried about. So it can be from general economic well-being to some specific advice and help. When I say that, people usually assume I mean that's for the big companies, but actually it's the small companies who sometimes need it the most.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And my job as president is really to do three things: help our members create jobs, grow the economy, hire and train and develop the best team. And that means being willing to hire, fire, train, resolve conflicts, inspire, set goals, help them prioritize. And then it's also to help a 100-plus-year-old institution prepare for the future. So I spend a lot of time talking to people and saying, I know that worked, and it was brilliant, and it's what got us here. It is not what will get us there. And so as comfortable and successful as it's been, we're all going to have to stack hands and agree that we're going to do things in a new way for the future. So I do those three things.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So just for my own edification, because this has been a question in my mind as well, the Chamber is a completely separate entity from the State Department or the Commerce Department and any of the state-level departments
That's
of
right.
commerce,
So it's not a government agency. We're a private trade association. We are a nonprofit that is paid by all those people I mentioned, chambers and AmChams and small and large companies, to perform this service.
Yeah, that's great. So let me shift the conversation a little bit now to the priorities that the Chamber has, and I'm curious, what are the specific priorities that you're focusing on for your member companies in the next 1 year? And I'm especially interested in the conversation that you might be having around export, trade, globalization, all of those issues that, at least in the university setting are front and center in all our minds, and we're thinking about, we're going down one path towards globalization. Are we now headed in a different direction? So please share your thoughts on that issue. Yeah.
So,
That was a long question,
well,
but
I
let's talk
feel
about
like
exports.
you're really, I mean, really can tell you're a professor because they're hard questions, right? Like I understand. Let's see, let's talk about, so you asked me first about member priorities and what we want to get done. And I think, look, this is an election year, so it gets harder to get things done, as you all know. But it's really, really important to our members that if we could get anything done on immigration, that we would. There is a deal to be had. When you go to the Hill and talk to people of either party, they say two things. It's okay for us to want to be able to control our borders, and it's okay to allow a lot more people here to become citizens and to get the right visas. The only difference is, depending on your party, you want to do one thing before you do the other thing. That's it. I mean, you could write a bill tomorrow morning that almost everybody would sign on to. The issue is they want the cover of the other side going first. We have got to get past that as a country. It's ridiculous. We need as much talent as wants to be here, be educated here, and stay here at all levels. So we'd love to see an immigration deal get done. Infrastructure is really important. It's easy for us to think of that as a domestic issue, but if you're going to have global supply chains, then one of the most important things is that your ports and your railroads and your airways and your trucks and your bridges and your cyber and your 5G and your all works, right? So infrastructure is always a perennial priority for us. There's some hope that in an election year when people want to get things done, you could actually move forward on an infrastructure bill. It'd be hard work, but really important. Trade issues, whether it's FDI here, whether it's opening markets abroad, whether it's new trade agreements, are always really high on our list. We have about 75 people who work full-time in international. So what does that mean? It means there are regional teams working on helping U.S. companies expand into markets overseas. If 95% of the people we want to sell things to live overseas, we want to make that as easy as possible, right, for a company here to be able to sell things. So my darling daughter, we just moved, and she wanted a poster. And because I have a day job and a child, and I'm on 2 public company boards and 2 nonprofit boards, my shopping time is about like this. So I'm on some late night website where I see the poster, $30 including shipping, done and done, ship it. It shows up 15 days later. My husband says, "What did you order from Barcelona?" Like, I ordered something from Barcelona? I don't even know. And it was this poster, right? So the more we can help our businesses, small and large, have that same opportunity, that we can reduce tariff burdens around the globe, that we can open markets around the globe, the better for our small businesses, for our big businesses, for our families, for our communities. So trade is always very high on our list.
Absolutely. And I would imagine that the current trade wars and the discussion around trade are creating a lot of anxiety and contributing to the uncertainty that you spoke about.
Absolutely. And I think business people are pragmatists, and so they are confused about China. You hear CEOs say, we really should stand up to this IP theft, and we really should stand up to some of these issues. And then they say, but can you do it fast? Because this is really hurting my business with the uncertainty. So I think people are confused about the best ways forward. And by the way, we'd love to see all of you guys with business degrees working more and more with the public policy people to try to put these solutions in place. It's hard to find them.
Yeah, I think business practice in the absence of understanding what the regulatory environment and public policy is not bound for a good outcome.
I think that's right, and I think it's really hard when you're thinking about business school and you want to think about operations and strategy and finance and all of the core skills you see yourself using in your career, and then you find yourself in a job that all of a sudden the company is just plummeting because of a new tariff situation or some new government regulation. They're the non-market forces that are at work end up having a bigger impact than you think they're going to. That and organizational behavior. I have a friend who went to Kellogg, and he always laughed that they used to make fun of organizational behavior, that it was the soft class and whatever. And then they go back to every reunion and say, oh my gosh, it's all about the people. Like, I want to go take all my OB classes over again.
That's right. I feel like I need to take my OB classes all over again in this role. Yeah. You spoke about immigration and infrastructure as 2 priority areas. And there's been a lot of rhetoric in the press, in the media, and even discussions on campus around what I would loosely call U.S. competitiveness or U.S. global competitiveness. And the big concern is that the U.S. has been the dominant economic power for forever, and is the center of gravity, is the locus shifting, and what is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or anybody who's sitting down on K Street or on Capitol Hill doing about it? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think the U.S. is still the powerhouse that it was from a business perspective, and if not, what should we be worried about?
We should do another show of hands. How many people think that the U.S. is an economic powerhouse? How many people think that's increasing? Interesting. That's interesting. I have a lot more questions, but I'm supposed to answer one now, or the professor and you will come out again. Look, I think what most business leaders believe is that American education, American students, American innovation, American ingenuity, American free flow of ideas, the diversity of America, and what I mean by that is that it is still a place that you can be what my father was, which is to grow up. To say my father was first in family to go to school kind of understates it, right? I don't know if he knew anyone who'd gone to college. And this is a place where then when he ran global divisions and lived in Brussels and lived in Paris and became presidents of companies, that is still a path that is available here. Most, I think, economic leaders still see that as a really unique American attribute, which brings entrepreneurship forward, which brings risk-taking forward. I ran a panel the other day at the Chamber with this wonderful young couple millennial business leaders with Steve Case, who was one of the initial founders of AOL.
Steve was here as well a few months ago, and he's terrific.
Oh, he's so interesting, right? And so we had this panel of young entrepreneurs there, and this one woman was the daughter of Korean immigrants, and she said, you love to talk about entrepreneurship as risk-taking, but it was easier for us. We didn't have anything. Like the risk, what was I going to lose? Nothing from nothing, right? So it was an interesting thing. So I would say that there is a lot that Americans, rich natural resources, ingenuity, education systems to draw on. The question is, are we going to get better at immigration? Are we going to get better at keeping people here that are educated here? Are we going to get better at figuring out a match with jobs, innovation, risk-taking, and the way that we educate people all across the spectrum? Are we going to be globalists, or are we going to try to retract from the world? I think it's just a question right now of, you're kind of at a tipping point of what happens. One of the things that Dean and I were talking about was this China issue with IP. We just had a briefing from one of the security agencies talking about the number of Chinese nationals that are sent here with some specific goals around IP and research and what they can learn. And what most institutions want to do is stay open and embrace the free flow of ideas, because that's who we are as a culture and as a people. Addressing some of these competitive issues as we go forward will be important as a country.
And those are tensions that are being brought to the surface and resolved as we move along. And there is a lot of uncertainties I'm sure your member companies are telling you about. Okay, well, let me now
move. And may I say one other thing?
Sure.
We aren't that good in this country anymore at teaching civics. And I feel like what really matters about that is we're raising generations of people who think compromise is bad. And we're raising generations of people who think that discourse is bad and debate is bad, right? As opposed to, I want to understand the three things you just said. What if I came at it from a position that you're right? How could you be right? What would it mean if you were right? As opposed to, I'm going to wait till you take a breath so I can tell you my point of view. And we're doing a lot of work on what would it look like to increase civics education in this country? What if you couldn't graduate from high school until you had passed a citizenship test? What would these things do for Americans and solidify the ability to tackle some hard problems? Because you're not going to tackle the hard stuff easily, right? With easy conversation.
And well, the nice thing about being on a campus is that we are ready to raise the difficult questions and have conversations around them. They're not always civil, but at least we raise the point. So, we are, as Rebecca mentioned, at the start of Women's History Month, and we just celebrated Black History Month. And I know that American businesses, as we have, struggled to get diversity and inclusion front and center in people's minds and also on the what I would call priority agendas. So I would love to hear what your member companies are doing in diversity and inclusion, and what are the discussions that are taking place amongst the C-suite participants around diversity and inclusion.
I don't know. No, I have to keep going, right? That isn't enough. Okay.
No,
what I mean by
we don't
that
know
is,
either. So
I think what I mean by that is, so at the Chamber about 2 years ago, we started a really big effort in this area. What I mean by that is that we stopped having a slogan and like a cute marketing thing to say, and put in some rules around what every slate of candidates would look like, and that you couldn't hire somebody until you'd seen a diverse slate. And guess what happened? Within 12 months, we had hired 3 African-American senior people, right? And when you get people to go outside their networks and looking for talent, it's
exactly right.
a really remarkable thing happens, right? When you blind look at resumes, when you use services that help you take bias out of resumes, those things. It's amazing how quickly you can get to a different place. When you start to say, does this job really require a 4-year degree? Or could we take someone who's in the process of getting that degree? You really open yourself up to talent. I think, I was on a panel last week on women on corporate boards, and one of the things we were talking about is women are an amazing amount of purchasing power.
Yeah, they do.
They control $1 trillion in investable assets, et cetera. So if you're a company and you're not, somebody was telling me that at one point Jimmy Choo didn't have a single woman on their board, right? I mean, really not getting your market people, right?
$2,000 shoes, right?
So I think if you are really looking for diversity, you're looking for a diversity of thought and opinion, and this is where inclusion comes in, because it's one thing to hire the right people or put the right people on your board. It's another thing to make them feel included and get their thoughts welcome, right? At the Chamber, in addition to changing some of our hiring practices, we also created a partnership with Howard University, put the president of Howard University on our board, and started a fellowship with them. It attracted a lot of attention from the HBCUs, and we just hosted 60 heads of the HBCUs at the Chamber for dinner as part of the White House initiative on what are their challenges, how is this going to work, how does that model work, how does it serve a community, which community, et cetera. That has drawn a lot of attention from our big members. And what surprised me is here we are, a smaller nonprofit in Washington, and some of the biggest companies in the world are saying, wait, what are you doing? How is it looking that way? How could we share in it? And so I think it still feels to me in a lot of cases to be a conversation.
It's an ongoing conversation, you know. The research suggests that the economic returns from having a diverse workforce are incredible. So there's a good business case for doing it, right? So as smart business people, we should know that we ought to be doing diversity and inclusion, not only because it's the right thing to do, which it is, but also because it makes solid business sense.
There's a business case. But the other piece of it is, and we were talking about this a little bit, is I get this question a lot about women on corporate boards. And one of the things that I like to talk to young people about, not just women, is yes, there is a demand side of the equation, and how do we make sure that companies are looking at diverse slates and looking for diverse attributes, et cetera? That is a piece of it. But there is another piece, and it is this. In this country, we don't have term limits for boards of directors, and we don't have age limits. So imagine yourself, as I hope you will all be, the CEO of a big company. Your board is largely 75-year-old white men, and one of them retires. You have one slot to get somebody who understands digital marketing, somebody who understands AI, somebody who understands China, a diverse person. I mean, you've got one slot to get that expertise on your board, and you might be looking at the next guy not retiring for 4 years, right? So it's not all bias. There is also this slot problem. So when people call me now that I'm on 2 boards and say, could you go on another board? No. Do you know anybody who could? What they say is, do you know a minority female who knows Chinese manufacturing and digital marketing? Right? I mean, it's a super, you know, and yes, I grow unicorns in my backyard. This is perfect. That we need to do work on. But what I would also say to all of you who aspire to these roles, you also have choices in what you are choosing, and choices in what you're choosing, choices in your path. And what I mean by that is, you can't, especially as women, pick, what did you call it earlier? All the pink shirt jobs, the pink collar jobs, right? You can't all decide you want to be in HR, which is a wonderful profession, and then be mad later that you're not on a public company board. You can't openly choose not to run a P&L, not to be in sales, not to be in finance, and then be mad about where that path leads. So while you're in education, figure out where these paths lead. And if you have an ambition, have something in your path that's getting you there, right? And that's not because it's a supply problem, but it is because there's a matching issue.
Yeah. So, this is an OB point again. You brought up the importance of OB. And, there are a lot of barriers to women advancing in business. Some of them have to do with just the pipeline. Others have to do with the jobs that we might be self-selecting into. And some have to simply do with, centuries-old attitudes and behaviors. So you interact a lot with senior executives in industry. Is it your sense that the glass ceiling is going away? And if not, what should we be doing as educators to help our young women advance and, really shatter that glass ceiling?
It's hard when you're the dean of a prestigious school, when you're the president of the U.S. Chamber, to say, oh no, there's a big glass ceiling, right? It gets harder when you're in some of these positions to have this conversation. What I think is clearly true is that you're not seeing the number of female CEOs move very much in the last decade or two. You are starting to see every single company in the S&P 500 now has a female board member. Okay, that's not a lot of female board members, but we weren't there a decade ago. So you see some movement, and I think the next generation is looking at things differently. But I think it's still, it's really unusual for me to be in a room that's anywhere near 50-50 women. And the amount of time that I spend with men is wonderful, by the way. They've been my best friends, married to one. He seems great.
Still doing well.
Yes, he seems fine. He seems good. But they've been sponsors of mine, not just mentors, but sponsors. I got on my first public company board because a man who was on it said to the CEO, you really need Suzanne, and I want to introduce you to her, right? So I think some of it is that. I was at a public company board recently, and I made a point, and about 10 minutes later, one of the big CEOs in the room said, I'm not sure that we're paying enough attention to what Suzanne said. And so you see men more and more engaging in behaviors where they're underlining what a woman said and highlighting it, that they're bringing more women into the room, that they're making sure those voices are heard. I really applaud that activity on the behalf of men because it's really, really helpful. It can be hard to be female. If you watch some of the debates, you can see that men can yell and seem authoritative. Women cannot without seeming shrill. But then you get to a point of, well, then women seem soft because they're not interrupting. It's a really complicated, centuries-old, how we expect women to behave thing. That then if you're gentle enough to be socially acceptable, are you tough enough to be the CEO? And finding that path is hard. And men that help women along in that and underscore it and don't participate in the, stereotypes are really helpful. And women who don't participate in those stereotypes are really helpful. And women who choose to bring up other women and women who choose to bring up other men. The more gender just isn't playing into it, the better, right?
Yes, I struggle with some of these same issues myself in my job. So thank you for the encouraging news that things are moving in the right direction. I know it's going to be a slow journey, but I'm confident that we'll all get there. And I know that all the young people in this room feel very differently than our generation does, and hopefully they will train their young people to also think very differently.
It's interesting. There was this urban legend about women being bitches to other women. That's a technical term. So, and I never experienced that. And then I had a woman, the generation ahead of me, say to me one time, it's because you weren't around when there could only be one. When it was true that there could be one woman, we probably did have pointier elbows to the other women because there was one slot man and I wanted it. It was competition and ambition, not that women don't get along, right? My generation hasn't experienced that at all. I don't find, if someone says, really, a woman's never been mean to you? I'm like, not more than the men. It doesn't seem to be a gender-specific skill.
Meanness is meanness.
Meanness is meanness,
Okay, I have two more questions and then we'll open it up for the audience. So you brought this up in some of your remarks. One topic that is trending big time right now is AI and the transformation of work. there's also this big discussion around digital data flows and what that's going to do to global trade. How is AI going to transform global trade? Do your member companies discuss this, worry about this, think about life where, humans and robots coexist? There's mechanization, jobs are going away. So tell us a little bit about AI and transformation of work and how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is viewing it.
I think it's one of, if not the number one thing that we're spending time thinking about. I spent the fall traveling around Europe and listening to academics and CEOs and think tanks there. And we're continuing that next month in South America. We were supposed to go later in the spring to Asia. We'll see if we're just Skyping those in now. I don't know. And the conversation really is about what is the future of employment and what does it look like? You hear CEOs now, and I'm sure all of you have heard this too, you hear CEOs saying, I could get rid of those 4 telemarketing centers or those 4 whatever. But if I do, who are my customers? Right? It's, at some point, just going after this quarter's earnings, I am robbing the very people who might buy my fill in the blank, right? It's the old Henry Ford thing that his employees had to make enough money to buy a Model T. Well, we're back there. So this question about the demand for workforce and what type of workforce is very real. I think what's hard is that when you finish with your degrees, there is such a demand for you out there that it's hard to imagine at the same time this conversation we're having. But last week, I'm going to put this down again. Everybody ready? This is going to fall. Like we're going to do this play again. Last week, the global head of Tata was in my office, and he, it's a $100 billion company, right? It feels like Dr. Evil made up kind of numbers.
They're a partner of ours. Yeah, it's a great company.
Amazing. And so have you read this book he just wrote?
No, I have not.
I just started it, and he inexplicably sent me more copies than I know what to do with. My secretary was like, do you want me to send these home? I'm like, no, that's a lot of the same book, so I will send you one.
Absolutely.
But it is a book about how he is convinced that machine learning and AI grow jobs. By expanding, expanding markets, by, if you look at healthcare alone, creating more markets, creating more demand, creating a broader middle class around the world that then needs more products and services. So he's convinced of it and has written this book. I asked him the question, does he just think that's true in the developing world, right, which is his thesis, or does he also think it's true in countries like the United States? And he does think that it's true everywhere. And you agree with that?
I absolutely agree. And, they would throw me out of my job as dean if I didn't tell you that that's exactly how we're training our students as well, to understand that really this is a technology that you can harness for economic growth, right? And it's going to create a whole new set of jobs. Those jobs are going to look very different from, we were talking about welders earlier, right? So, we're not creating welders, but we are creating, a new generation of people who will understand how to work with the technology and the data in concert with the robots, right? So we're talking about sort of the human-machine intelligence synergy, and that's what we're training our students in. So I agree.
This is one of those things that later Courtney, who works with me, is going to say, I don't know why you tell that story. So if you're this is the moment, if you're wondering when it is. So when I got my MBA, we decided at the end that we were going to have a prom and that we were going to have a band, and we had a superlatives committee, and we had a total blast, by the way. I highly recommend it. We had a blast.
Oh, yeah, that's an
It was
idea
really
we can
fun.
steal.
And we invited
Mike,
a lot
you
of the
heard that?
professors.
Let's steal that
It was
idea.
super fun. Anyway, I was voted 2 things in my class. I was voted most likely to succeed and least likely to ever be able to use Excel. I don't know if the first thing came to pass, but the second certainly did. Like to this moment, I still can't use Excel. And I'm doing fine. Like it's all worked out for me, so you don't feel bad. But what I remember so strongly about whatever the model was or the program was, were wonderful professors who said, you may never do this. You may never be in finance. You may never be an accountant, or you may never be in operations. But you should aspire to manage people who are. And if you don't understand how long a task takes, how complicated it is, the inputs to it, it will be impossible for you to hire the right board, hire the right people, manage these functions, right? So I think you're so smart to be thinking about, it's not teaching the current program or the current thing, it's what are the leadership skills, how do you take lots of data, analyze it. How do you hone your judgment, hone your network, hone your social emotional learning, right? The things that robots and machines can't do, your creativity, your ideas, the psychology and ethics behind business. Where does business add value? Where are the right markets? What is your intuition about those things, and your intuition about people and judgment and teams? How do you inspire people, right? I've never been inspired by a machine. And so those skills are just so important, and I know you're focused on them, and it will serve all of you well.
I'm surprised Alexa hasn't started inspiring you yet, but we'll keep that conversation for another day. And by the way, we have Zainab in the room, who's our celebrated Excel teacher, so she'd be happy to offer classes later on.
I know. It's an embarrassing story, isn't it?
I'm with you.
I know.
Okay, so my last question before we open it up to the audience. The Chamber gives out these corporate citizenship awards, and can you tell us a little bit about them and how the Chamber views this interrelationship between business and society?
Sure, and I'll broaden it just a little bit because our foundation does a lot of work with your school, which we really love. I don't know if any of you ever participated in our case competition. You should. It's super cool, and it's really good prize money. The goal of the case competition was that we were hearing rumors from our members around the country that even business students weren't feeling that pro-business. And that felt really dangerous to us. And so we thought about what's the fastest way to impact the biggest number of business students. And so we hired a Dartmouth professor who helped us write a case. And we're up to about 100 schools that have been participating in sending teams, and FedEx supplies the prize money. But each year the case is a variant on the theme of what does a job mean to a community. So you have 5,000 jobs over 5 years, you need to move to a community. What are you telling the community is what are you marketing that would then give you the best incentive package, right? Or vice versa. And it has really been fantastic to talk to business students about what a job means to a community and talk about why business is so important. Corporate citizenship is the same way. We believe that when businesses do well, they can do good. And they do a remarkable amount of philanthropy in this country. In fact, it's interesting the amount of burden, if that's the right word, responsibility placed on business now, right? Of societal problems that they should fix, of there's not enough to create good paying jobs and benefits, but what are the other societal benefits? And there are companies who do it really, really well. So we have multiple categories from small to large and give away citizenship awards every year, in part to recognize and celebrate the businesses who are doing it, but in part to create inspiration and best practices for other companies that they might be able to model. Because at the end of the day, I started this by saying, I really believe that business is a calling. There's a book by that name, by an author named Michael Novak, and he talks about the fact that for most people in the United States, and certainly around the world, you don't have to imagine that far back to get to poverty in your family. You can imagine, for most people, it was a parent, it was a grandparent, maybe it was a great-grandparent, but it's not unknowable. And if you talk to those people, they know the person who gave them a break. They know the person who got them into school, who gave them the loan, who gave them the job. It's that personal, right? And as businessmen and women, you have the role of providing that opportunity to people, of creating a product and a service that then allows other people to go to school and other people to get jobs and other people to have their problems solved. And that is a noble calling. And I think sometimes we forget that as we're looking for role models in our own careers. But if you took one thing away from this conversation, for me, it would be the world needs you. It needs your skills, it needs your ingenuity, it needs your risk-taking, and your ability to take all of that and be in business is really important. And I laugh all the time about, and I really usually just say this to undergraduate students, but you have all these kids that are in fancier degrees, right? And they have these great archaeologists and fine arts and languages and people who are studying these really elegant things. And they expect all of you to pay for that. You're going to pay for the philanthropy, for the hospital, for the arts, for the thing. And at some point as a society, we have to say we really value that. And we really value that risk-taking. Because the day, we were talking about this from the Entrepreneurship Center, the day that you don't feel safe taking that risk is a really dangerous day for American competitiveness.
So well put, Suzanne. And I will say I had lunch this weekend with the ex-CEO of PepsiCo, who is a supporter and donor of the Smith School, and he shared his story of how he came from an impoverished background. Somebody gave him a break, sent him to a land-grant university where he got an education that was affordable.
Amazing.
And now, look at him. He was CEO. He retired as CEO of PepsiCo, and he's giving back in such a big way. And you realize that it is that one break, right? So,
That's right.
So thank you for reminding everybody that they need to be risk takers. Go out there, hustle, shake the trees. There are a lot of battles to be won, a lot of mountains to be climbed. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca and her team to see if there's questions from the audience.
If you don't ask questions, they're going to ask questions of you.
I know. And it wasn't too long back before I was in the classroom, so
That's right.
I'm ready to roll with my questions.
Well, while the students are getting their questions ready, so maybe I'll ask you one. One topic we didn't cover today was climate change, and I was wondering how does that figure in the priorities of the chamber and also of the member companies?
I think it's different depending on what industry you're in, right? And how you're serving both your customers and also attracting employees. So it's become, for example, really important to tech companies to think about climate change solutions because it's so important to the employees that they're trying to attract. And it's a way that the next generation is really, I think, changing the world, right? At the Chamber, our view has been for a long time that the solutions will come through innovation and technology. We don't see people giving up the amount, the cars are not going to zero in the time it would take to have an impact.
Yeah.
And so we have really felt that in order for business to earn the seat at the table, that we needed to talk about it and say, yes, the climate's warming, yes, man is contributing, yes, fossil fuels are contributing, and what are the solutions about that, and what can we agree on that doesn't it doesn't have unintended consequences at the same time, but that in order to earn that seat at the table, we had to be more realistic about potential solutions and potential problems.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, institutional investors have started now voting with their feet and taking a very careful look at the environmental impact or the climate footprint, if you will, of any company that they're planning to invest in. So this is an area that I expect that your member companies are going to come back and start looking at very carefully in the future as well.
It's really interesting. I had the chance to talk to Barbara Novak at BlackRock, who was one of the co-founders and really leading in this ESG movement. And she said the most interesting thing, which was she almost wished that the E hadn't come first, that the governance pieces are really important, and that the concept of sustainability isn't just environmental sustainability, but it's really, if you're in the entertainment business and you don't have a Me Too policy or plan, you're not sustainable. If you're in California and you don't have a water plan, you're not sustainable. And so figuring out what's actually material in the ESG space to your industry and your company is really important. And so many companies are confusing CSR and their foundation work with ESG. And that's like a whole other panel.
That's a whole other panel, but that's a great point that you just made. I mean, I think there is confusion in the marketplace as well as to, what does the E mean, what does the S mean, and how a company's realizing it or actualizing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to have a question. You're spending all of your free time here.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
My question has to revolve also about the environment, but you had also mentioned CSR, corporate sustainable, or corporate social responsibility, excuse me. So my question is when you're working with all of these different businesses and they all have different definitions of what they value as being responsible or what they want to put in their business, how does the Chamber of Commerce balance that and maybe even educate businesses on what should be important to them?
That's a good question. Let me think about it. Let me organize my thoughts for a minute. I think that from my seat, not even really speaking for the Chamber, from my seat, one of the most important advances in CSR in the last decade has been the coordination among the business community. And what I mean by that is that when I was at the chamber the first time, in what feels like 112 years ago, it was during the time of those really bad Asian tsunamis. And I don't know if you remember, well, you're all too young probably, but there
That
was.
was 2004, wasn't it? The
Yes,
Asian,
yes.
Yeah.
So what was happening is that businesses and American businesses and global businesses were very generous in their relief efforts, but they were really bad at it. So all the boats went to one village and all the fishing nets went to a different village, and it was just a mess. And there was big learning out of that about, okay, how do we share best practices? How do we come together and coordinate response? And so we've seen a big rise. We do a lot of that work for companies. We've seen a big rise in the coordination after Puerto Rico or after Katrina or after, it's gotten better. And I think some of that is just sharing best practices. I don't think that we would tell a company what to do. So much of their CSR is tied to their business plan or their community or their headquarters. A really cool thing we're seeing increasingly is companies, that's the word I'm looking for, decentralizing their CSR and creating local budgets for local teams and millennial teams to figure out what's important to them, which we've seen is really cool too. So, the trends are really neat. And our Center for Corporate Citizenship has a pretty great website if you want to see some of it. Or you could come intern there and really learn about it.
There you go. There you go. So I have a quick follow-up on CSR. Is it your sense that, the money that's going into CSR, we're getting the best, if I may use that phrase, bang for the buck from it? I mean, is that money being wisely spent? I mean, you spoke about the lack of coordination, or maybe some of the money didn't get to the right place at the right time, some of the relief didn't get. But in general, are companies becoming better at identifying CSR ROI in the projects that they invest in?
I think that they are. I mean, it's like anything. You could find good examples and bad examples, right? But I think the trend line is an improvement. And I think what's become really cool are the public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
So that I think companies are getting better at really going to either nonprofit experts or government experts and really figuring out what would be the most helpful as opposed to guessing. I think you're seeing more of companies' dollars in this area being spent on areas of real need as opposed to maybe 20 years ago things that just felt good. And you're seeing in response, I'll tell you a quick story. There is, you could guess who this was, so try not to because I'm trying to be subtle.
Yeah.
There's a really big health nonprofit that does amazing work, but is really left of center. And they were doing a lot of work with us.
I'm wondering who you're talking about.
And
Just
the
kidding.
group
Yeah.
that was, and their board said,
Yeah.
what are you doing working with the chamber? That's business. They're the bad guys. And the woman who at the time was running it was awesome. And she said, wait a minute. The number one indicator of the health of a community is its employment number. It's the number one indicator. So we can't have good guys and bad guys, right? It's the number one indicator of how clean the rivers are in your town. There's a lot that all goes together. And I think going back to the civics education, figuring out how we're all partnering together to do this work is the most important piece, as opposed to having good guys and bad guys who then aren't coordinating the work. And I think a lot of what's improving has come with those public-private partnerships and with this strange bedfellows.
Yeah, I mean, our strong belief is that business and society have to work together for the greater good, right?
Right.
There can't be divisions.
That's right.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm a retired management consultant, whatever that is. And currently I'm pursuing my passion with the business mentoring and coaching. And so one of the things that I'm doing is working as a volunteer mentor with SCORE, which is part of the SBA. And just going back to your gender point, and I have an observation, and I don't know, your comment on it, that the at least 50% of the mentees that come are women, right? So at the SBA level, at the small business level, it's a lot of women, right? At least 50%, and then even some of them, the male owners come, and normally it's with their wife, so they're the ones that are really pushing them. And then also with my experience with microfinance, a lot of it goes to women, right? In developing countries and traditional societies and so on. So I'm just wondering what's happened, So it gets to a certain point, and then once the bigger the business is, or the more complex it is, or whatever. And the second part of the question is, you know, talking about civic education, right? I guess there's there's a role, or there's a space in that to discuss things about gender, right? And what the chamber can do to support that or push that effort in society.
So I think that a couple of things. One, let's see if I can keep all these thoughts straight. Remind me to get back to women if I forget. I mean, the second part of your question about what the chamber could do. Starting with your other question, here's what I would say. As you know, it sounds like even better than I do, the range of difficulty of why women don't scale their businesses at the rate of men changes, and it has a lot to do with geography. So as you know, if you're talking about microfinance and you're in some really complicated parts of the world who don't yet value women, there is a lot of women who start businesses, and when they hit any kind of scale, they're taken over by men, sometimes violently, sometimes horribly. And so that is something that we have a nonprofit that does some work on. It's how you protect women entrepreneurs in those societies. So that is one end of the spectrum, right? If you come to the United States, we still have this issue where if you survey female entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs, a lot of the female entrepreneurs are doing it as a way to support their families and have the work-life balance that they want. A lot of men who are doing it to make it really big and grow their business and scale their business. So there's an ambition difference when you survey the entrepreneurs. And then for the women who do have the ambition to scale, there's a huge VC problem, and that women do not get the capital that men get. And I think that is the place that places like the chamber can be the most helpful. And I'm sure Steve talked about this when he was here.
He did.
There's also no capital going outside of 4 cities at all, right? So really figuring out how we are financing companies generally with more geographic diversity, but also looking for female entrepreneurs. And this gets to what you all can do as business leaders, which is, and it goes back to some of the differences. When a female is asking for money and talking about their future, a male sponsor who says, it's not bragging, you take the number up. A male sponsor who says, you've all seen the statistics where a woman waits till she's 100% qualified for a job to apply for it, and a man is like 30% qualified. He's like, I'm sure I could figure out the rest, and applies, right? Well, women need to be more like men in that regard and be a little bit more lean forward and ambitious in what they can do. And so, lots of different pieces, but I think that last one on capital for minority businesses and female-led businesses is a specific place the chamber could help.
Well, I'm going to close the evening with a little brag about our Ladies First program that is run at the Dingman Center for Entrepreneurship, and that program is designed to specifically help young women entrepreneurs become successful and overcome the kinds of issues that you just alluded to. So yeah, we're very proud of it, and we're producing some wonderful young women who are going to be members of the Chamber of Commerce in the next few years.
I can't wait. And in the meantime, so I'm S. Clark, no E, at uschamber.com. And for those of you looking to expand your network and find internships and opportunities and all of those things, feel free to reach out. I'll make sure that either I personally or somebody else gets back to you to figure out how we can help. And the greatest advice I ever got from a business school professor was, leave every institution better than you found it, right? And work so that every time somebody imagines integrity and creativity and innovation and intelligence and kindness, they think of you. And I have to tell you, I have seen all of that in the students and professors and staff that I've met today. What an impressive group of people. You have a really great job.
Thank you, Suzanne. Please join me in thanking Suzanne for...
Thank you.
For such a wonderful and educational conversation, and we have a little memento for you. This is to make sure that you always remember this memorable evening.
Thank you.
If you would be so kind as to open it.
I will.
And I can relieve you of that,
Okay.
as we just discussed.
Okay,
There's
yeah.
no place in women's clothing to put these things.
That's right.
So
not made for women. Oh my gosh, I love it. Okay, guess what animal it is? Really? That's so sad.
yeah. There you go. So
I
I love
So
it.
Suzanne mentioned she loved all the turtles on
I
the wall,
did.
so we figured we would give her one to take home with us.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you so
wonderful.
much again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I love when people are going to ask me if I went to Maryland with this in my office, too. Oh, I want to hug you so much, but I won't. Oh, I can? Okay.
It was just wonderful chatting. It was exactly. You were brilliant. The stories were great.